Hey everyone. Before we get into today's episode, I wanted to let you know about a special Q&A episode that we have coming up in December. We're going to be talking to Kevin Elmy from Cover Crops Canada. So if you have any questions about cocktail crops, using them for feed, forage, or even just as a green manure for your cropland, send us a message. Let us know what you want to know. There's a pinned post on our Facebook page you can comment on, or you can email your questions to podcast@pcbfa.ca, or you can tweet them at PCBFA on Twitter. Thanks, and enjoy the episode. Coffee, Cows, and Crops is produced by the Peace Country Beef and Forage Association and hosted by Extension Coordinator Johanna Murray. On this podcast, we discuss management practices and research results with scientists, ranchers, researchers, and farmers. We strive to share innovative information and farming practices supported by sound science and practical wisdom. So grab a cup of coffee and let's get learning. Hi everybody, thanks for tuning in to today's episode of Coffee, Cows, and Crops. Today I'm chatting with Kelly Sidoryk from Holistic Management Canada about long-term planning in the farm business. But before we get into all that, Kelly, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about how you got started with holistic management?
Okay, thanks, Johanna, so much for having me. So holistic management has been around for a number of years. The concept was put together by Alan Savory, and our family first learned of it over 30 years ago. And we were in a transitional phase in our operation, and I wasn't even actually working at home on the home operation at that time. But one of the things when I first was introduced to it, and of course, it talked about the land and the livestock, which appealed to me. It talked about the finances, which I felt was important, but it also talked about the people. And that was really an epiphany for me, that it actually put the people side back in with the other two components. And so with that, because I'd always had leanings towards that personal growth piece of it, as well as the agriculture base that our operation was, a predominantly livestock operation. So many years ago, that really sparked our interest, and we got involved with the organization. We did a bunch of training and continuous learning. That's one of the tenets, is being open-minded and a lifelong learner. And I decided to do a self-directed, it was called the self-directed degree program at that time. We have a different certification process for educators nowadays, and embarked on that. And my focus or thesis at that time also was families in business, which is not surprising that I've continued to be interested in that area and worked with a lot of families now in the succession arena, whether they are involved in holistic management or not. So that's kind of the background. And then we transitioned our operation to be predominantly forage based. We have everything, for the most part, seeded down to grass and practice adaptive multi-paddock grazing. We did one transition where my brother and I took over from our parents, and now we're starting another one where my kids are wanting to get involved in the operation and are involved, actually. So a work in progress, I suppose you could say there. Or maybe it's the 4-H learn to do by doing. How many times do you have to do it? But I certainly stress always that the succession planning component isn't just a one-off event. It is a process for sure. So yeah, and along with that, I am still a certified educator through Holistic Management International, and I also sit on that board of directors. So I've really had some amazing opportunities, as I said, to learn and apply and meet some really, really great people along the way.
Right on. So what we're talking about today is mainly long-term planning. And it can be a tricky thing to think about because we never know what next year's going to look like, or what the weather is going to do, or what prices are going to do. So with all of that variability in mind, why is it important to maybe get a long-term plan in place?
Well, one of my favorite quotes of Alan Savory, and of course there's many, but one of them was, people don't plan to fail, they fail to plan. And I think just what you said, Johanna, there are so many variables, and we put a major emphasis on the planning process, not only way far out creating that shared holistic context goal, but then really a lot of emphasis on annual financial planning and annual grazing or cropping planning, depending on what's going on. But again, just circling back a little bit, I think because there is so much variability, that is why we need to really start focusing in and talking about, well, first of all, why are we doing this? And, then furthermore, what are we hoping to accomplish and what are we hoping to achieve? So we really kind of sit back, big picture, long view, and then start bringing it back to, okay, what does that look like for the coming year?
Right. That makes some sense. So with that in mind, what sort of goals would you recommend that people maybe start with when they're thinking about getting a long-term plan in place?
Well, one of the things that we really emphasize in our 3-part holistic goal or context, one component of it is the quality of life, and based on the values that we have. So really talking about not only for you as an individual, it can apply that way, but also the team you're working with, the family members, really sitting down to talk about what are we trying to create here? What kind of life do we want? And, those aren't always conversations that we typically have in agriculture on our farms and ranches. I don't know too much about other industries, but, I think that's a really important piece of it, coming together. And as leadership expert Simon Sinek talks about with the golden circle, and really, why are we doing this? And then the next level of it is the production and the behaviors and systems. So we think about, if we've identified what kind of quality of life we're trying to achieve, what do we need to produce to achieve that? For many of us, part of that is going to be a profit, but also it's not only about the financial end of it. It's also about, what sort of in supportive environments perhaps do we need to create for, continuing education, for improved communication. So we really try to look beyond, when we think of what we are actually producing, it's not just the finances or the commodity, but it's also, how we're wanting our operations to be for the individuals that are in it. And then the third one is the landscape description or the future vision of really thinking about way long term. What do we want our operation to look like, and the community that we're part of, and our customers and our resource base that we're working with? So having some pretty significant conversations as a family or a team or whatever the case may be, but really taking the time to talk about that and create that shared vision.
Right. So part of the reason I wanted to talk about long-term planning is we're coming off a pretty tough year. Not a lot of feed put up, so it's probably going to be a bit of a tough winter in a lot of areas too. So how does long-term planning relate to how you respond to wrecks, or, when the weather really doesn't cooperate one year or something like that?
Well, I think a big part of it is having that vision and goal of where you're trying to go. Of course, we can make all the plans in the world, and I'll often say life is never going to go exactly according to plan, but having some steps put out there about what are some of the ways you can do that. Of course, the financial planning is a big part of that. And in these challenging times, I think it's very important that people get back to making sure they're revisiting that. And, we try to do monthly monitoring. And even if you can't do that with your financial plan, at least do it seasonally. Now it's starting to get a little bit quieter and we can start looking back and then also doing our forward projections. The financial planning piece also has some strategies and tools where we really analyze our enterprises to see which is contributing the most to our overheads. Also, in that, trying to be certain that you might put your average estimates together. You can put some good ones in, but also poor as well. So here's a perfect thing to start talking about right now. This, for many of us in Western Canada and parts of the United States, was quite a dry year. Whether it was a full-on drought or not is somewhat variable to where you are. But starting to think about right now, okay, what if the conditions next year are the same and don't improve moisture-wise? You need to be starting to put some plans together to be certain that you can manage through that. What's your carrying capacity going to be like? Again, you already mentioned the feed and the cost of it. What's that going to mean for our overall bottom line and some of the strategies that we should do differently. And of course, planning ahead, then if you're doing that and monitoring, then you can see where the missteps are happening so that, for many of the ranchers where they sell their calves once a year, if that misses the mark, then you've still got the whole rest of the year to try to get through. So what are some other strategies that you can come up with to do that? And relying on the creativity of your team too, I think is an important piece of it. So again, there's so many variables, but you can make some assumptions based on last year's projections, the market. And so at least you have a sense of confidence that if things go average, it will still be all right.
Right. That makes sense. Now, you mentioned relying on your team's creativity. Just really quick, do you want to talk about who you think should be involved in making these long-term plans and how to involve them?
Yeah, well, that again, as we've talked offline, kind of fits in with the succession planning piece. And, one of the strategies in the holistic management decision making right at the beginning, is we really kind of put together and assess our starting point. So of course, that's going to be the land base, the livestock, machinery, equipment, all the assets and that kind of thing. But I really try to stress to people also, I think we should be paying more attention to the strengths, the skill sets, the interests, and the passions of those that are working along with us. And certainly as we start looking at transitioning to a next generation, realizing that it's in all likelihood the operation is going to change, and I think we need to be open for that. And the more that we can improve communication and have these discussions on our team, I think that's important. So certainly supportive of the idea that the key decision makers for sure need to be involved in that. And then it'll depend on each operation, which, is another important piece of holistic management we talk about, is that each operation is unique. And they're unique to one another, and it's even unique to time. Like next year is going to be different here, obviously, than it was this year. And so knowing that there is that adaptive component and the flexibility needed. So as we go on and think about some of those things, I think sometimes, especially in challenging years, we just really wish that somebody would come along or we could find a solution that's just like, follow these 10 steps, silver bullet, everything will be marvelous. But the fact of the matter, it isn't. And holistic management isn't like that. We use a decision-making framework, but it's really up to each operation to apply the principles in the most appropriate way for them. So that, getting a little bit off, but that tangent from the original question, but I always think the more people, the better. Now, the flip side is that it can become very unwieldy and cumbersome if there's too many people. But thinking about the roles and the responsibilities that people play in the operation, and then should they be included in those conversations or not?
Right. Now, I know for myself, when making really long-term plans, it can be tricky to break down that someday eventually goal into steps that are kind of actionable or that sort of thing. So how do you go about building that action plan towards your eventual goal?
Yeah, well, I think that's when we kind of get into the strategic planning, which is, the overall 5 year, like we're talking today. Or some people honestly will break it down into 3 years. But really where we start with, again, is some more visioning and saying, okay, by 2026, what's going to be going on? And then really starting to think of, okay, in a perfect world, what would be happening in 5 years? What do we want to have happening in 5 years? What do we want the operation to look like? What do we want to be doing for work? What do we want to be doing for fun? Who are the people around us? And so depending on where you're at, maybe it's easier to do that for a 3 year span, but really thinking and get concrete. How old will you be? With some of those specific. And then what we do like to do is have people sort of really reflect and do that individually, and then come back and do it for the team, the farm, the operation, and say, okay, at its very best, by 2026, what's your operation looking like? And this is a dreaming type of exercise. So we try to keep the, oh yeah, buts out of it, but just to say, really, if things went very well, those are fantastic exercises to learn some more about each other too, and improve communication. And, then, and maybe some new opportunities come up. If one of the members says, well, I really would like to have a farm store, that would be so great, so a way to explore some of that. But as you said, once you've determined that, you can't get that all done in the next 6 months. So we kind of break it down into goal areas, which, often in farms and ranches, one's going to be land and livestock, another's probably finances, probably another human one, and then perhaps a succession plan if you're starting to work on that, and think, okay, well, if that's what we're shooting for, like 2026, what needs to happen in 2022? Obviously, it's not all going to, and start putting those pieces together. One of it is probably the annual financial plan. Make sure that happens. The grazing planning and your cropping plan, those are annual events. But then beyond that, what do we need to start doing? Is there a new enterprise being considered? And what are some ways and strategies we would go about achieving that? And then break it down. Okay, if that's the outcome that we're looking for, then let's get real specific. And when does that need to happen? Who's going to do it? Do they need some extra resources? And, there's a really great way that you then have that planning then builds into your regular management meetings, because you have a calendar that said, we were going to get our financial planning done by the end of January. So have that meeting. Where are we at? Who's doing it? And same with the grazing planning. Are you buying more bulls? Put that in there. Another piece of it will be taking a family holiday. Okay, who's planning that? It's really, really a great process to start putting those pieces together to, like you say, Johanna, bring it back to, okay, what do I need to do in the next 6 months to a year, that all those steps are still taking me towards that longer term vision.
That makes good sense to me. So we've already sort of touched on succession planning, but we can't really talk about a long-term plan without at least sort of thinking about that. So what are the top 3 things that you think people should be working on, or should at least keep in mind when they're planning for succession?
Well, certainly I think that step that I referred to in holistic management, where we create that longer term shared vision, is really powerful and an important piece of it. And probably for succession planning, there's going to be a spillover into estate planning. So in those conversations, more family members are likely to be included than those that are just managing the farm. I mean, that's the starting point, right? Again, including the more people you can, the better, to try to start figuring out some of these things. I think another important piece of it is the contingency plan, because it's not if I die, it's really when. And so the more comfortable we can become talking about those conversations now and hearing what people's hopes and dreams and wishes are when they're still sitting at the table having a cup of coffee with us. Because as anybody knows who's gone through tragedy and loss, these conversations are difficult when everybody's there and present. They're way harder when somebody's recently gone. So the more conversations you can have about that, I think the better. I can't stress that one enough, actually. You know, I was doing a workshop the other day, and the question that I put to the group was, does your executor know that they're your executor? Because lots of times people put their wills together, they pick somebody, don't necessarily even ask them. 20 years later, that's still the person named in the document, you know. And is it good to have children by themselves, or a single child from a family be the executor by themselves? I'm not sure. I think that maybe an outside trusted family friend could be part of that. So, you know, when was the last time you updated your will? And so I often encourage that to be the starting point for bigger succession planning. But just like, if something happened tomorrow, where does everything stand? And again, we feel that these are, well, they are. It's a sad thing or a depressing thing to talk about, so we avoid it. But the more proactive we can be, I just can't stress that one enough, because I really think it is important. And then another big piece of it, I think, for those of us that might be turning the reins over or moving aside, is to really recognize these operations are not going to look the same when they get transitioned to the next generation. The upcoming kids or young people, I mean, they're enthusiastic, they're smart, they're creative, they want to do some things differently. And I really think we need to give them the freedom to be able to do that as well. I'm not sure if that was 3. You asked for 3. There might be some combos in there, but
on that note, do those recommendations change if your succession plan includes passing the farm to someone outside your family, like an apprentice or something like that, or even just selling the operation? Are there other things you need to consider, or is it kind of the same?
You know, I really think it's kind of the same, because if the farm is going to be sold outright, then I would hope that the family knows that, right? You know, so that communication is important, regardless of whether it's staying within or whatever is happening. And also, you know, if it's being passed on or transitioned to a non-family person, like an apprentice, there's still a big knowledge transfer that needs to happen, and the management, you know, and those are really the same, trying to figure out, you know, how we help people get the information and the experience that they need, and what sort of parameters do we need to put in place for that.
Right. I do want to circle back a little bit to the long-term planning. And you mentioned a little bit about how important it is that our long-term planning be adaptive and that sort of stuff. So are there certain things that we should really be considering, or steps we should take when we need to revise our long-term plans or goals?
Well, you know, as part of the actual financial planning process, the monitoring piece, I think, is so important. And for everything it is, but, you know, whether it's on your land or in the human dynamic as well. But just one of the things that we recommend is that you have a strategy for the financial planning where you put all your planned figures in, and then each month you go back and put the actuals in. So referencing a wee bit, this is more detailed what I said before, so that every month you're able to see that where you are on track, or if you're not on track, to achieving that ultimate profit that you have planned in the first place, to figure out how that's going to happen. So figuring out other indicators, I think, in the monitoring, how do you know that you're on track or not? I think it's so true that nothing is going to go 100% according to plan. But when everybody has a sense of what direction we're going and what we're trying to achieve, that really, a lot of amazing things can happen when a group comes together like that, for sure. But also, lots of different things, positive and negative, will impact us, and we do need to be adaptive so that we can try to say, okay, boy, we've got a vulnerable area here, and maybe another tool that can really help with that is not exclusive to holistic management, just management in general, is the SWOT analysis, where you sit down and do your strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats. Usually the strengths and weaknesses are looked at internally inside the organization or the operation, and the other two, the opportunities and threats, are more external. But I think those can help you be a little bit more poised for change and adaptive, if that kind of goes to what you were asking.
That makes some sense to me. It's funny to hear you talk about including people and stuff. I had a chat with Dallas Mount from Ranching for Profit, and he said a lot of the same things about you have to include people, because if you include people, then they know where you're going and they're on board with the plan.
For sure. And I mean, lots of us will know of examples where children, or the next generation has said, no, we're going to go do our own thing. We're not going to be actively involved in the farm. And so they go away for a few years and then come back. I think that's happened a little bit more in Western Canada with the challenges in the oil and gas industry, where people find themselves at a crossroads and think, you know what, I didn't think I was going to go back to the farm or ranch, but now I would like to. And again, that connects a little bit with what I was saying before, being open to, well, how can we support some more enterprises? There's some that I personally am not interested in doing, but if one of the kids wants to and can put a plan together, again, be creative and inclusive. And I think that's an important piece of it. Or, another example that I use, and I've seen this too, is that when you're having some of those conversations, those visioning dialogues, where somebody will say, you know what, I don't actually really want to be doing this enterprise anymore. And so maybe, I know of an example where there was cropping, grain, and livestock, and they decided to kind of split them into two separate operations. They still work together a lot. And interestingly, they both have started to include the enterprise that they had shifted out of initially. And that's going to change again as the next generation comes along. So I think that's an important piece of it, because in that way, people aren't feeling compelled to stick with a pathway that they never really wanted to be on anyway. That's not a good way to build a sustainable or regenerative operation if people are just kind of feeling like they've got to go along with that. So, but again, those open and honest conversations aren't always easy to have. And as my good friend and mentor, David Irvine, always says, we just got to keep practicing at it. It's like a muscle, and we're not used to using it. We're really good at growing things in agriculture, but not always some of those other areas. So we just need to keep working on it.
For sure. So I think we're running up on time here now. So, but before we sign us off, are there any resources you would like to mention or events or any of that sort of stuff for people who are interested in learning more about holistic management or making plans or that sort of stuff?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, there's a multitude of good resources. Certainly the internet has widened that scope for us. So, the holisticmanagement.org is the site for the Holistic Management International. There's also holisticmanagement.ca. That is the Canadian version. The Savory Institute has a website, which is easy to look up. And all of those have and will have different workshops and events and learning opportunities, which of course now, one of the good things that's come out of COVID is this online learning. So there's a lot of ways to do it without being more in the traditional setting. I'm still biased. I still like learning with people when we're all sitting in the same room, as you know, and can do face-to-face, because it's not even so much about the transfer of knowledge from the facilitator or the teacher, but all the shared knowledge that we can get in a group. But it's amazing, even with Zoom and some small groups that I've worked with, we've really learned a lot and become quite a close group. So some of those things, there's all kinds of resources out there for that. In Western Canada, we try to model our winter training. It usually happens in the winter, as you know, because it's 5 or 6 days of in-person. And as we've done up in the Peace Country, if there's enough of a group, if there's 6 families or farm units that want to get together and have a workshop, then we totally would do that. And we have some more educators in training coming up that are participating in that. So that would be another really great way to share some knowledge. And of course, I got to give a shout out to you guys at the Peace Country Beef and Forage Association, because you're a great resource for all kinds of events and learning opportunities and that type of thing. I'm not totally sure what this winter is going to look like for in-person, but even hybrids might be popping up on a smaller scale. And I have my own website, kellysidoryk.com, that people can check out.
Awesome. I'll put the link to some of those down in the description of the podcast so people can find them and look them up and all that good stuff. Well, I think that is where we'll wrap up for today. Thank you very much for coming on. It was good to chat with you.
For sure. Thanks so much for having me. And you can probably put my email in the show notes or whatever you guys call it on your podcast. And yeah, really enjoyed the visit and the connection, and always like checking in and connecting with people. So if anybody wants to reach out to me and have more questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Peace Country Beef and Forage Association is a research and extension group based out of Fairview, Alberta. Our mission is to help producers thrive in an agricultural system that is profitable, regenerative, and attractive to future generations. To learn more about what we do and see the results of our research trials or our archive of newsletters and fact sheets, check out our website at peacecountrybeef.ca. Want to get in touch? Have a burning question or a topic suggestion? Send us a message on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. Thanks for listening.